So thank you for all of you to joining us today. This is being recorded, so if you're not able to join today, you can definitely share the link tonight or tomorrow morning with your friends and colleagues so we can keep spreading the service design knowledge. Super quick catch up on what we are going to do today. As always, this is sponsored by Slalom and Precocity. So we are very grateful for having our sponsors to help us put these sessions together. I think it's number 23, I believe, today with Jared. So we're very fortunate to be able to give him the chance to reach out to a much global audience. This is in Dallas. And I'm Greg Lacroufy from Slalom, and this is Brandon, Robin, and Brenda, and we are Switzerland Network Dallas chapter, but we've been given the opportunity to reach out to, obviously, other countries through this global pandemic. So we had a great opportunity for us to reach out the world. As you can see from the chat, we had people from Colombia and Sweden and sometimes China. So thank you so much for joining us. It means a lot to us. And Jerry's going to be very excited to talk to all of you today. As I was just saying, all the shows are recorded, so you can go to our YouTube channel and check out the last 22. Jared will be probably tomorrow morning, I'm assuming. You can check it out, see what he has to say today. As we just discussed earlier, if you have any question for Jared, you can just go into the chat and just very clearly make it obvious to Brandon and Robin that is a question for Jared. You're welcome to talk to each other, engage. It's usually a very, very, very busy chat, and we love that. But if you have a question for Jared specifically, just let us know. And in 45 minutes, we will start opening the floor to those questions. And as Brandon was mentioning, Jared can definitely talk to you in person, which we usually don't do. So it's kind of like a new thing. He can definitely kind of like interact with you if you choose to have a couple of personal questions. So today we're going to be talking about UX and SD. So it's complicated, right? So I talked to Jared offline a few weeks ago, and we decided not to give into the controversial and not to be divisive, right? There's a lot of blogs and people out there who are very trying to label things that probably shouldn't be labeled as hard, right? There is UX, there is SD, there's a whole bunch of stuff. At the end of the day, we're trying to be more inclusive and kind of like understand like UX and SD is basically the same thing. And we're trying to sort through that today. And Joe's going to kind of go through this with us and explain what UX does, what SD does, where does one start, when the other one picks up, and the interaction between the two of them. So it doesn't have to be as hard and complicated and divisive as combative as some people make it sound. It's actually a lot of fun. We are all UXers and some of us are more like SDers, if that's even a word. But we're going to talk about this today, right? So Jerry's going to be talking about exactly what his own personal definition of this ecosystem of tools and methodology and skill sets are. And of course, we'll dig a bit deeper into that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let me just very quickly start about this. So the idea we're going to be discussing today is that UX and SD is really all about levels of zooms and resolutions, right? So kind of think in terms of like, not me against them. It's more like, what can we do together as a team based on what the needs are? So as you are probably familiar with, it's like a basic blueprint. And as you know, in a blueprint, you can do a very holistic view of the experience. And as the journey develops, you can decide as a group to kind of zoom in on a particular area, right? So it could be the e-commerce that has some issues. It could be the onboarding that has some issues. It could be the call center, right? But you can decide to kind of zoom in this one particular touch point and sometimes turn that into its own blueprint. So we have different ways of us to zoom in and out of a problem and find out areas of opportunities, challenges, white spaces. So this is something that we do very comfortably as service designers, so we do for a living. And then we're going to talk about levels of resolution, right? So the best way for me to describe that is that there is the Super Mario, the 8-bit Mario, right? So very low resolution, it doesn't do a ton of stuff. And there is the Super Mario, like 4K, that does a lot of stuff. So that can be applied into what we do, right? Some of the stuff we do in the strategic design, business design is very nebulous, right? It's like 8-bit. We just don't really know a lot about what we're doing. It's a lot of ideas, a lot of concept, a lot of blue sky. And on the end of the spectrum, it's pixel perfect, right? It's definitely 4K. Everything has a place, everything has an order, everything has a color. We get very, very finite into what we do in terms of typography, icon design. We get really, really, really high resolution on things we do. So, for example, if I apply this into something I borrowed from Cornelius Richelieu out of Canada, who teaches ecosystem design, we can actually apply the same thinking to that, right? So the very high resolution stuff we do, like color palette, typography, very finite stuff, is high resolution for sure. And even the UI thrives there. And as you move up onto the level of material design, the resolution gets a bit more like loose, right? So the stuff you do on a global level, like quantum superposition, for example, which I'm not even sure what it means exactly, but it's really loose, right? It's probably not even an icon, it's more like a dot. So we're going to talk about this with Jared and see exactly where we sit here, right? Some of the UX stuff is going to go from the bottom to the top. Some of the 3D design is going to pick up some of that in terms of resolution as we go from like a screen to a series of several screens to some other stuff. So that's how we're going to try to define the relationship between UX and service design in a much more friendly way, a much more inclusive way. That's going to be helpful for you to understand what you want to be doing. As you know, a lot of UXers fall into service design kind of like by accident, and they want to know more about it. And there is some confusion about like, what should I be doing? What should I not be doing? What tools should I be using? So I'm going to let Jared dive into that a bit deeper. So of course, I've mentioned Jared's name 100 times already. I'm assuming everybody here knows who he is. So Jared is joining us from Boston. I put like North Andover, which is technically where you live, but let's just say it's Boston, right? So Jared, if you want to introduce yourself for a couple of minutes, tell us who you are, what you do, and we'll just take it from here.
Okay. Well, I'm Jared Spool, internet sensation and teen heartthrob. I run a small company called Center. We help people identify how to work strategically across an organization, how to bring UX to their world, and how to deliver better designed products and services. And so that's the work that we do. We have a school for UX designers, and we train designers, developers, product managers, all sorts of folks on how to be more strategic in the way that they use UX. And so that's the type of work that I do. The way that I think about it, to sort of expand on what Greg was saying, is that in my head, there is no difference between what one might refer to as a UX practice and what one might refer to as a service design practice. And to sort of talk about that, the way I think about it is this. I started in this field back in the 70s. And when I started in the 70s, there was no such thing as UX. What we think of as user experience, the phrase user experience, wasn't coined until 1993 by Don Norman. Before that, it was called a bunch of things: user interface design, usability, human factors, software human factors. There were all sorts of things that it was referred to, but it basically the business that that I started in, the world that I started in, was really just how do we create things that people can use. My early work was all in the first generation of personal computers, building the things that we now take as sort of a given. having a computer in front of you. When I started, the idea of having a computer in front of you was non-existent, right? The computer lived in a data center. At best, you had what we referred to as dumb terminals, which were these basically just a keyboard and a screen connected by a wire to the computer, and later on connected by modems to the computer. And so the processing power was not in the device. And if you wanted to do something on a computer, you had to be an engineer or someone who could actually program the computer to do the thing that you wanted. So if you weren't trained in computer operation, if you weren't trained in computer usage, you didn't get to use it. And being that we were working on the first generation of personal computers, we had to think about what those interactions would be like. And so I got to work on the first, word processors and spreadsheets and things. And we were trying to figure out, how would you make a computer so that you didn't have to go to training to use it? When I started, the word processor was a self-standing unit. You could buy one from Digital Equipment Corporation or the Wang Corporation or IBM Display Writer. You could buy these standalone units, and they were mini computers. The DEC word processor had a PDP-8, which was the same computer in it that Apollo 8 had in it when it went to into orbit. And these computers, if you wanted to learn how to use them, you had to take a course in, there was a 1-week course where you learned how to load a file, save a file, print a file, and change the ribbon. And then if you went to the advanced course, which was the second week, you got to learn about bold and italics. Italics was difficult because you had to change the wheel on the Daisy printer. But the thing about it was that back in those days, what we focused on was basically, you could think of as the user interface, right? So we focused on just what was on a screen, and all the work that we were doing that we would today refer to as UX work, all the sort of usability, human factors work, was all about, filling out a screen. And there was a book, this 250-page book called Guidelines for User Interface Design, but user interface software, guidelines for user. But we all referred to it as Smith and Mosier because those were the authors. And it came out in 1996, and it was the compendium of everything that you could do in a user interface. If you're American, your tax dollars paid for this. It was commissioned by the Air Force, and it was this large, big compendium. It's not existing anymore, but it was every research study that had ever been done was summarized in this book about how to get screens built. And that was our entire world. Everything we worked on was about how to make screens work.
So, Jared, that's a perfect segue to my first question. So let's just move to that. My question to you is, as we move from the early one-screen interface, which you mentioned now, to more sophisticated designs, how has UX helped become more intuitive, which is where we're going to, I'm sure, and more obvious to users what to do next without training?
I think that we have to take this apart first before we can talk about this in terms of what is intuitive and what is obvious to users. We need to sort of talk about what the elements are. And so the basic elements here is that when we were just focused on the screen, everything that we did as a professional was encapsulated in that focus on the screen. And that's all we worked about. And it wasn't until we'd gotten a handle on that. We'd gotten websites, we'd gotten applications that we were working with, that we started to think about screens being knitted together. And our focus changed, and suddenly the practice of UX changed. And all of the work that that we were doing at the time became about moving from screen to screen to screen, or from page to page to page, in terms of a user experience. And we graduated from this focus of being about the user interface to a different focus, where suddenly we were thinking about the flows of how things move from one screen to the next. And those flows turned out to be what I would refer to as today's sort of notion of user experience design in that regard. And that was sort of a change. That was a big shift. And so this, we could say that this lasted from the beginning into the 90s. And then this took us through the 2000s and into, about 2010 or so. And here we were focused on, information architecture, and we were focused on wireframes. The tools that we had, all the things that we did changed from what we were using in just when we were focused on a single screen. But we still had to be able to go back and design the individual pages, the individual forms, the individual screens. That didn't go away. And that sort of brings us to this next big shift, which happened around the 2010s. And where that happened was that what we found was these websites and apps that we had been working on, they existed in these modules that basically connected up different aspects of a business or different aspects of a service offering. And we had to now sort of deal with how people moved from app to app, from page to page, from in-person to brick and mortar to online. And this is where this idea of sort of thinking in terms of service design starts to become apparent. And the thing is that service design still has the various apps or websites. Within those apps and websites, we still have screens or modules. So service design is just a different resolution. What we've done, the way to think about this is we've pulled the camera back, right? We start by just focusing on the UI. We pull it back and we see that the UI is connected through different screens. We pull it back again. We now have a different framing. And that's where service design comes in. And from this perspective, it's fluid. There is no difference between service design per se and UX and UI. That distinction is pretty much irrelevant, which is why we see all these people saying, well, what I want to hire is a UX UI person, because they don't see that there's a distinction here. And my guess is we're already beginning to see, and we'll probably see people saying, well, what I really want is SD UX UI, because they're asking for the same thing. We're just zooming in or zooming out. And the difference in our work is really just the tools and techniques that we use at any given point.
So Jared, at this point, what do you feel? Let me share my next question, which is perfect timing. What do you feel has been the biggest challenge for UXers as users move from single application to complex experiences that span multiple applications? What you just described now, what has been the biggest challenge for UXers to actually move up and down this ladder?
uh, the challenges are just keeping it all in your head and keeping it fluid. I think it's very much about this idea that what we're trying to do is think about entire systems. And we've always been thinking about systems. It's just that back in the olden days, when we were just focused on UI, the systems were extremely simple. And the processors were extremely simple, and what you could do with them were extremely simple. Back when I first started working on word processors, we didn't have the processing capability to actually do word wrap across an entire screen. So the way we did it was we faked it. You would only be able to enter data on the bottom line of the screen. You couldn't see anything that came after the text you were editing, except for what appeared on that line. And everything above it was the part of the document before it. So imagine, it's sort of like typing into a text box, and everything's always just on the last line, which for most things that you create from top to bottom is not a problem. But as soon as you try to scroll back up, the way we hacked it was we would scroll the text down. And this was because the tools that we had couldn't support what we were trying to do. But as processor capability increased, the tools allowed us to do more and more things. We now have the computing power to word wrap on the screen. Back in the 80s, when we were developing the very first personal computers, that was extremely difficult. And as a UI designer, I had to know how the word wrap algorithm worked. I had to understand that level of detail. But as the capabilities have come up, we've built toolkits, we've built systems, we've built widgets and components, we've built interactive systems, and now we can build all sorts of things where, with a bunch of APIs, I can build an app which not only works on my computer, but also can SMS me, can call me on the phone, can interact back and forth. And so now understanding the full dimension of what we can and can't do, I think is where people get a little stuck. And so I think the challenge, to get to your question, the challenge that people have is that there's this problem with just understanding the full power that we have available to us to actually create experiences are great. And what people do is they end up putting blinders on. They say, well, I only work on this stuff and I only do these things. And as a result, people, we end up limiting folks. And that is the key piece of it. So it's really about this idea that when you move from one resolution to enough, I think that your example of the Mario is not quite accurate to how I'm using resolutions here, because I use resolutions more in a sort of map making sense. So if I can go in Google Earth and I can zoom right into my house and I can see where my house is on my lot, and I can see what furniture and where my car was on that day. And all the pixels are there. And the satellite resolution gives me all of that imagery. And I can see all that detail. But I'm only can see what the screen can contain of my lot. And if I zoom out in Google Earth, I now can see my town. I then can see where my town is in relationship to Boston. I can see where I am in relationship to the Northeast. I can keep pulling the camera out, but I lose the image of my house. I no longer can see that. And I'm now working at a higher resolution, but the number of pixels that I can see at any given point is still the same. And that change in resolution is what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is that the big challenge that we have is that when we're working at service design, we're not seeing what the individual interactions are. And those individual interactions can be incredibly critical to the success. But what we're doing in the field, and I think this is where the mistake comes in, is we're training some people to be service designers, and we're training some other folks to be to be, UI designers, and they are not capable of that fluid change in resolution.
So that leads me to my next question. So let's talk about this for a second. And I get this from your post last time. So with service design, which is what we're going to talk about today, we move to a resolution that expands the UX experience across over time and distance, which you just mentioned now. The UX component of the experience still needs to design the applications to level, but the challenges now are the organization-wide level, which you just described now, your house and the zooming up and down, right? So what are the challenges both UXers and service designers face today? As you just mentioned, some are trained and have skills to be doing like the small things, and some are trained and skilled to be doing the bigger thing. And how do you reconcile those two?
Okay. First, no distinction between UXers and service designers. So that does not exist. So let's just start with that. Second, what we're talking about here is that there is basically this, we have to be able to work fluidly, and we have to be able to move up and down through the resolutions. And we have to have all the tools that we need, because let's take wayfinding as an example. Wayfinding is a part of the design process. And so if I'm designing, checking in for a flight, there's a component of that can happen digitally. I can check in for a flight on my phone, but I also need to be able to check in for a flight at the airport. And if I'm checking bags, I can do some of it on my phone, but I can't physically put my bags into the phone. So I have to take them and I have to check them in at the counter. And there's often a disconnect between what I can do on my phone and what I can do at the counter. And it's almost as if those two worlds were designed separately with no recollection that one has worked with the other. So for example, at the counter, the airline will hand me a physical ticket, a piece of paper that says they accepted my bag and has tracking information for the bag on it. That, for many airlines, is not connected up with the app on my phone. So I can't actually use that ticket in conjunction with the phone. And until we think in those terms, we're going to get caught. And so the distinction here is a distinction between roles and skills, right? There is no role of a service designer. There is no role of a UX designer that makes any sense whatsoever. What there are people who have skills that are good for one or both of those things. And when we start to talk in terms of skills, the roles that we have dissipate. We don't need them anymore. And we can now get to working on the whole solution and not working on just a piece of the solution. and that to me is the crux of the premise that I'm putting forward, which is this distinction of there is service design and there is UX design is doing more harm to our practice than it's actually helping.
Okay. Another thing that came through, like, as you shift through those resolutions and zooms, I guess my next question, and share that. Are you also shifting the focus and scope? So you just mentioned, for example, looking at your house, and I think you have an article about the pollution, for example, right? So we actually go through the resolution levels. Do you have a feeling that designers, so let's not call them anything, have a difficult time shifting focus, right? Versus like recycling your trash versus the global pollution, the focus and the scope changes as you move up and down the resolution. How do you handle that?
Well, I think it has to, I think that one has to sort of be thinking about the next level up, right? There's an old maxim in the design world of, if you want to design a chair, think about the table. If you want to design a table, think about the dining room. If you want to design a dining room, think about the house. If you want, you're always sort of looking at the next level up. And I think that's where the work needs to be done, is giving us tools and expertise for thinking in terms of the next level up. And in terms of things like service design, one of the key things that distinguish service design from a higher resolution, a next level up, which I have posited, for lack of a better term, as ecosystem design. So if we think of service design as a service that contains both online and offline components that interact with each other and that users move through in various ways, there's a resolution beyond this. And that resolution beyond this is when we have multiple services interacting simultaneously. And those services are doing their own things, but they're interacting in a bigger space. And so, for example, one project that I've been working with, tangentially involved with, is what happens when refugees come to the United States. So, for instance, the Afghan, we evacuated 85,000 Afghanians and brought them to the United States. There was part of that's the immigration system, but then there's this whole other part, which is a refugee system. And the refugee system has a government component and it has a lot of non-government organizations that work in conjunction, a lot of community organizations. And then within that, there's what happens at the state level. And all these different organizations are coordinating. And how do we do design across all those organizations? How do we design policy and tools and systems that make the refugee acceptance process be much smoother, much easier, much more helpful? And these types of cross agency systems, one of the things that you have in service design that you don't have in ecosystem design is a single port of governance, right? If I'm designing an airline, I have a way to assert authority, to assert governance across the entire airline and say, this is how we're going to design the way the airline works. But when I start working with different agencies, different parts of government or different organizations, now each organization has its own governance, but there isn't a single source of governance. And when you don't have a single source of governance, you have to design differently. Just like when we were designing across multiple apps, we had to design differently than when we were focused on a single app. which we also had to design differently. And then we were focused on a single screen. We needed different tools. We needed different methods. We needed different philosophies, different design principles. And we need to be working across that. So designing up for the next layer and saying, okay, if I'm creating services, if I'm working on the airline problem, if I'm trying to figure out how to make airline travel better, I have to work in this system where I have physical airports, which I don't have a lot of control over. I have governmental regulation. We do this in a global setting. There are connections that I connect with other airlines, so who are either code partners or not other code partners. So now, how do I integrate all of the processes? So if I'm flying from here to Thailand and I take a British Airways flight to London, and then I take a Air Thailand flight to Bangkok, how does that system work? How does that entire ecosystem work? That is the challenge that we have. And so understanding how we design in each of these levels is, I think, the big space that we get to work in, the big place we get to play.
So I know that education is important to you as to us. So my next question is, how do you recommend building a design team, regardless of labels, that is equipped and prepared to shift through those resolution challenges, scope, ecosystem, and can still deliver exemplary work? What you described here, a team of designers has to handle that, right? And not all the teams are adequately prepared for that. So what is your recommendation in terms of like building a team that can actually tackle this kind of really nebulous and ambiguous kind of subject?
Well, again, I think the technique is that we have to focus on skills, not roles, right? So when we're building a team, we need to think in terms of the skills that everybody has and what skills are we missing. So in any sort of team building, the way that an effective way to do it is to first determine the outcomes you're trying to get to, not the outputs, right? Not we're going to deliver this system, but the outcomes. And a UX outcome can easily be defined as, if we do a great job, how do we improve someone's life? So we can look at, if we do a great job on accepting refugees and getting them settled, how do we improve the life of the refugee? How do we improve the life of the community volunteer? How do we improve the life of the government employee who is doing background checks or creating immigration status or whatever it is that they do? How do we improve their experiences? How do we improve their life? So we focus on those outcomes, and then once we understand what the outcomes are, we look and say, okay, what skills do we have that we can take advantage of, and what skills do we need more of? And do we need more? Do we have some, but we just need more of them, or do we not have them at all? And we look at that and move from there. So this is, when we're talking about this, what we want to be talking about is how do we look at what someone can contribute to a team in terms of assessing their skills, not focusing on job titles or roles or anything of that sort, but what skills do they have? So then when you build a team that has the skills necessary to achieve the outcome, which, I've reduced it to make it sound very simple. It's quite difficult.
It's complicated.
But that's the approach.
Okay. Jared, we have a ton of questions. I don't want to be abusing your time. I don't know how much time you have, but we're going to start getting you some questions.
I'm going to be on the planet for years, so I'm good with time.
Okay, all right. Brandon, you have a first question for Jared?
I mean, none of us really know how much time we have.
That is true. That is true. So I'm going to jump to Kimberly's question, because I have the same question inside. So Kimberly Morton asks, what about the non-digital components of service design? And I'll allow Kimberly to elaborate. From my point of view, it's like, for me, service design encompassed things like how to tell a patient they have cancer. There may not be a screen at all, or how to move through a museum. Let me unmute. So Kimberly, you can now unmute yourself and kind of elaborate on that question as well. But that's kind of what it means to me, that service design gives us the freedom to design any kind of experience, whereas UX traditionally has primarily been focused on digital experiences on screens.
Well, I'd argue that that isn't a tradition. It's just a convention, right? UX didn't just focus on that when I started in it. I think that was just the artifact of the .com boom. But Kimberly, do you want to add to the question?
Sure. When I think of an artifact like a service blueprint, to me, the service blueprint has probably equal components of design and process engineering. So I think of it more as kind of straddling between the UX world and the process world. Plus also understanding like
Sure.
the roles and back end players that are in support. I started out in UX, and that was not really something we ever thought about when we were designing an application, and maybe we should have.
Yes, well, that's the point, right? Is that we should have. A lot of the things in service design are to compensate for what we weren't doing when we were just focused on the user experience of a digital artifact, right? So we're just undoing that compensation. But there isn't anything inherent in a service blueprint that does or does not apply to digital work, right? It talks about what happens that the user sees and what happens behind the scenes. And for instance, anybody working on an app that has a lot of machine learning will need something equivalent to a service blueprint to be able to understand what the algorithms are doing that the user can't see. And so it's just a set of skills to produce a blueprint. And there isn't anything that someone who is trained in UX, as you've shown, there isn't anybody who's trained in UX who can't do a service blueprint if once they're taught sort of the method and skills to doing a service blueprint. And there isn't anything that is about a service blueprint that suggests that it would not be useful if all you were focused on was screens in an application, because there is a backstage, there is a front stage, there are processes that are happening, there are components to those processes. And so, this has always been the case. And all we're doing is shifting where we pay attention to, not changing the actual nature of design.
Yeah, I agree with you for the most part. I think service design, I think a lot of times the focus is on creating an app to solve a problem, where service design says, well, maybe a conversation is part of the process that solves the problem between two people, and there's no digital component at all. But
here's the thing. If we taught everybody in the design field to ask that question, we'd end up with better apps.
Yes, we would. 100% agree with you on that.
So the issue here is that we haven't taught everybody to do that. And we keep trying to segment roles, saying, well, you're not allowed to ask that question. That's what a service designer does. And that is what gets us into trouble, right? Everybody should be asking questions from the moment somebody says, in fact, I don't have, oh no, I do have it. I was wondering about it. I have a cup. It says, not every problem is solved by an app, right? That should be the starting point of every discussion is, how do we get to this point where we are not trying to solve everything with an app, and we start to ask the question, what are the underlying processes behind this, and what are the system interactions? So that is, I don't think that this is because we have two different disciplines. I think it's because we aren't training people to ask the right questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jared. Robin, do you have the next question for Jared, please?
I do have a question, and I think this is going to follow right on the tail of asking the right questions when we are designing for things. And Michelle Chang had a question around how can insert your term service design, or this expanded definition of UX, help address digital challenges like privacy, security, and agency in an increasingly surveilled world? And Michelle, feel free if you'd like to follow up on that question.
Yeah, Michelle, can you expand a little on that?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Jared. Thanks for your time today. I mean, I think it's a lot of like design ethics, which is a common topic that I've seen pop up throughout like conferences and things like that. Like what we should do versus what we can do a lot of the times is the question, which is kind of fundamental. And I'm wondering if service design is like in any way uniquely positioned to capture some of these like potential unintended consequences at the beginning of the process. But of course, there's also, you know, business needs that need to be met with any sort of organization. But how can we be like, I don't know, the voice of the user, or whoever the user may be, maybe their priorities might differ than a business's priorities. So things like that.
Well, there's a couple things here, right? The first is as a field, we have to have a much deeper discipline around ethics, right? Other professions have had to deal with this. The medical profession, for instance, has very much changed over the last 150 years, such that the way that that medicine now thinks about what a patient needs and what a patient has a right to is much, much more different than where we were in the days of, you know, Tuskegee and other sort of crimes against humanity, where we were doing medical testing on people, primarily marginalized people, Black people, in ways that were very much harmful to them. And so in one frame, you know, I mentioned that we can define a UX outcome as, you know, if we do a good job, how do we improve someone's life? We can expand that definition of a UX outcome to say, to ask a second question, which is, if we do a good job on this, who gets harmed? And so we need to be asking the right questions in that regard. In terms of meeting the needs of the business, if there's no way to meet the needs of a business that without having to harm someone for the business to succeed, we need to start asking the question, is that a business we really want to be involved in? And is that match the values that we personally have? And we have to sort of start to ask those questions and have honest discussions about it. Because if the businesses we are in, if we give them the out to say, well, the priorities of the business come first, and then we'll try and make things better for people. First, that's not sustainable. And second, that is, you know, the equivalent of continuing down these forced paths that say everything gets, you know, deferred because there's profit. And I think that is a bigger challenge. And there are people who, like Kenneth Bowles and Mike Montero, who are in a much, much better place to talk about these types of things than I am. But those are Alba Villamil or Sakai Farai, or I can think of a bunch of people who are really the right people to be talking about that part of the conversation. But the key thing here is that there's nothing that stops us from putting an ethical lens on everything that we do. And again, when you design for the next layer up, when you say, I'm designing the app, so I'm going to focus on the service. I'm designing the service, so I'm going to focus on the ecosystem. When we get into the ecosystem and you start talking about surveillance economy, right? That's a complete ecosystem issue. We are collecting data from people, and then we are allowing it to get into the world, and we are not paying attention to where that data is going. And as designers, we should definitely be paying attention to that, where that data is going. We should be communicating that to the user. We should be getting their permission to distribute that information. We should give them control over that information. And why is that not part of the service design that we're doing today? Why is that not part of the app design that we're doing today? And so all of this stuff suggests that we need to really focus on the ecosystem work to be able to tackle this idea of true benefit and no harm.
It's 1 o'clock.
And it's 1 o'clock.
Jerry said he had plenty of time, so let's just abuse his time then. Let's have another question, Brendan.
Absolument. So early on, let me scroll back up. Julian Hector said that it feels like you're headed in a bit of a mischaracterization, that service designers absolutely track and design touch points at lower design levels of resolution. So, Julian, do you want to kind of elaborate a bit on that? Is Julian still here? Let's see.
It's possible Julian is not still here, but here's my take on that. There is, designers focus on the lower level of resolution, right? If they are service designers and they encompass all the levels of resolution, they're also UX designers, they are also UI designers. So all the designers are now basically one thing. And the distinction between service design and UX design and UI design becomes less important. And but the thing is that if you look at the curriculum of schools producing degrees in service design, you are not seeing them spend time on UI design or running usability tests or the tools of the lower resolutions. You are seeing them focus on service blueprints and the bigger questions. So they are not getting the full depth of skills needed to do the work. And that's the contention, is we keep trying to segment this so that we can create curriculum so that we can train people in a reasonable amount of time without asking the questions, what are the full gamut of skills that need to happen?
Excellent. I think that makes a lot of sense in the sense that if you restrict yourself to this little place or this little place, then all of a sudden, then the titles seem to make sense. But if you don't, right, and if you're like, oh, I like to do that and that and that, and all of a sudden the title becomes almost meaningless because you're using multiple sets of tools to accomplish similar or even the same kind of experience.
Yes, but this leads to this false notion of specialization, right? If we say service designers specialize on just things in the service layer, then the problem with that is that they are ill-equipped to do the work because they can't. In order to do the work, you have to be able to fluidly move up and down through the different resolutions. And uh, uh, other fields don't do this, right? If we think of the medical field, you can be an orthopedic surgeon. You can specialize. In fact, you can be an orthopedic surgeon who specializes only in hands and wrists. There's a doctor at Leahy Clinic, Stephen Margles, who is the world's foremost expert on wrists and hands. And if you have an issue specific to your wrist or your hand, you can go see him. He sees pretty much anybody, but there's like a 6-month wait because he's up to his elbows in hands and wrists. The thing is that in order to become an expert at hands and wrists, he first had to become a doctor, which is a general practice. He had to learn how to deliver babies, how to suture wounds, how to clear an impacted bowel. He has to be able to do all of that, none of which is part of his daily practice today. But to keep his medical license, he has to stay up to date on all of those things. And so he has become what we might call a generalist first, and then went to school to study orthopedic surgery, and then he got a fellowship in orthopedic surgery as it relates to hands and wrists. And in that sequence, he became very specialized, but only after he generalized. And his work is completely generalizable. We have to treat design as being completely generalized, and then we can specialize. And the specialization won't be service design. It will be privacy or security or financial technology or some other thing where there's a specific domain or set of knowledge that is unique and highly valued, that makes you more valuable than people who are just focused on it. And by the way, while I'm doing this, I want to dispel the myth of the unicorn, because this notion that someone who can do everything is a unicorn is false, because a unicorn is something you cannot find in real life. And there are plenty of designers who regularly move up and down through the levels. And this argument that, well, you can't do everything, but then when you say, people don't do everything. No, everybody moves up and down. Service designers work at the UI level. They have to do that, right? Okay, so we can't have it both ways. We either all can do it or we can't do it. And the fact is, there's enough evidence out there. And I have a school which trains people how to do this. Absolutely. There are real people who can do this, so they are not unicorns. They may be acorns.
So Jared, this is what the dream is, right? But like the real life currently is different. Like we're starting to see going like service design, generally starting to specialists. Now we actually have people actually in service design actually specialize in one of the double diamond or one specific section of that, which is the opposite of what we're probably trying to say here. So how do you feel about the market calling for more like hyper specialized service designers?
But it's not calling for hyper specialized. That's why everybody gets pissed for the thousands of ads that say UX UI design. The market, people want folks who can come in and solve problems. If they want somebody who has a set of skills that they need, they will look for people who have those skills. But that doesn't mean that they have a title that reflects the natural set of skills that they have. And this idea that we're going to try and categorize the world into these titles, well, for one thing, it's just a complete information architecture issue. How do you create a taxonomy of all of design? How do you put every possible combination of design skills into a taxonomy that makes sense? We don't have a naming structure that lets us do that. So then people advertise for things like product designer or full stack designer. And what are they doing? They're looking for people who have a range of skills to cover the nature of the entire problems they're trying to solve. And that's what we need. That's where we need to focus. Not on this notion that there's a constrained set of ways that we can present ourselves and work.
So practically speaking, what do you recommend people like ourselves to market ourselves? Because as you know, recruiters, they look for keywords, right? So they go into LinkedIn and search for like product designer or UX. So what is your recommendation before on this call? And I think somebody just asked a question. How does a person then market themselves if they do have UX, SD, CX, industrial design? What do you call that person? How do you market yourself if you're that person?
Okay, first, recruiters who look for keywords are bad recruiters. They're just not good at their job. So we can keep catering to them, or we can decide that they are not the way we're going to interface with the organization. A good hiring manager, a manager that knows what they're doing, and a good recruiter are not looking for keywords. They're looking for comparable experience. What they're looking for is, have you ever done this work before? So if I'm going to build something, let's say I'm going to build I'm going to build the check-in system for my airline, right? I need to hire people who will help me build check-in systems for airlines. I need to be able to decompose the work and figure out first what the skills I already have on my team are, which skills everybody has. I don't need to hire anybody who has those because I've got enough. Which skills some people have, but we have enough people to do that. Again, don't need to hire for that. Which skills I have some people to do, but we definitely don't have enough because work backs up and we can't get all the work done because I don't have enough people with those skills. That I may need to hire, or I may need to train other people on the team to do. And then finally, the work that nobody has the skills for that I absolutely need. And it's those latter two categories that people are going to want to see. So this notion of keyword matching, that's not how you market yourself. If you really want to know how to market yourself, the way you market yourself is by letting people know of the things you've accomplished and how you accomplish them. And you create a network of people who are always looking for people who have accomplished those things. And you work through that. Most great jobs are not found through recruiters. That's the worst way to look for a job, right? You're that and just randomly applying for positions that post, right? What you should be doing is reaching out to people who are in the community and actually making contacts and developing relationships and learning how to what they need, and then talking about your work in terms of what they need. And that takes a lot more work on the applicant side. It takes a lot more work on the hiring manager side, but it gets much better results than just randomly applying for jobs and hoping that you win the resume lottery, or trying to code up every possible keyword so that some piece of software spits out your name to the right recruiter at the right moment. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, I agree. Let's see. Robin, do you have another question for Jared?
I do have a question, and I wonder if Sarah Johnny is still with us.
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, your question about design thinking placed under the umbrella of service design. And I'm curious if you're going in the same direction I went in my mind with this thought of these disciplines being outside of design. Is that where you were headed with it?
Sarah, you want to say more about this?
Sure. So I'm a design thinker / product strategist, but in the work that I do is discovering new products and experiences. And so while I'm discovering them using design thinking, I'm using service design to peel back how, to basically discover these products, because they don't exist in a silo. They exist in an omni-channel world somewhere. So I would call myself a design thinker, but since service design has in some cases shown design thinking to be under the umbrella, it almost feels like a design thinker alone can't do their job without having service design, right? So like how do they relate to each other as practices or crafts?
I don't think they are separate practices. I don't think there's a distinction between a design thinker and a service designer. I don't think that, I think there's a set of skills that people employ. And so I am not of the opinion that one is under the other, that there's some sort of hierarchy or some sort of Venn diagram that shows that you are either this or that and that there's an overlap. None of that to me makes any amount of sense. You have a set of skills and you bring those skills to a team. And sometimes you bring them into a team for which there is no overlap. You are the only one with that set of skills. And they are hiring you because they want you for that set of skills. And other times, you join a team where there's a huge overlap in the set of skills. And when there's a huge overlap in the set of skills, you behave differently because you don't have to do all the things. You do some of the things, and it becomes a conversation about, hey, why don't you do that and I'll do this? And since you have an overlap in skills, it doesn't really, if your skills are comparable, it doesn't really matter who has those skills. So we conflate roles with responsibility and skills, right? If we just look at the skill set and then divide up responsibility based on what skills are available at a given moment to tackle a given activity, it becomes a very different conversation. And we don't have to be constantly trying to play some taxonomical game of saying, this is part of this is under this is over this includes this excludes this, right? None of that is helping us at all. And so I am of the perspective that what we want to be doing is focusing on what does it take to get the job done? And how do we deliver that? What does that sound, Sarah? What do you think of that?
Yes, I love that. Basically, what I just wrote in the chat, like, sounds like what you're saying is job description should be more focused on what you're trying to accomplish, and skills are like the how. And that actually helps people find the right role because it helps them know the skills they bring to the table, but really understand what they're signing up to do or accomplish.
The best job descriptions are just a list of the things that you need this person to accomplish over the next year. That's all they are, right? And when you have a job description that's that, then you can say, show me that you've accomplished this before. And the entire interview process is around how can I find out from you whether you have the comparable experience I'm looking for? And it becomes a partnership instead of somehow I'm going to list a bunch of requirements and you have to jump through some sort of reality game show style hoops to prove to me that you have each of those requirements. Does that make sense?
Love it. Agreed.
So, Jared, I think we can probably just close it up a little bit. Do you want to do one final statement about the relationship between UX and SD? I mean, you went on for like 45 minutes about this. I just want to make sure it's is clear to everybody. This is the same thing. It's just a matter of kind of like where you start and how you end up. It's not a matter of title, it's a matter of role, it's a matter of mindset. Do you want to kind of like wrap this up and kind of like stop it once and for all?
Sure. My supposition is this, that there is no real difference of any meaningfulness between service design and UX design and UI design and policy design or any other sort of thing that you might take into account. It's just a collection of skills. Most people will not have extreme depth in all the skills. They'll have some depth in some skills and some depth in others. Some may just be really good at one thing, right? But the musician Prince could play 15 different instruments really well. He could play guitar, drums, keyboards. He could concert performance play any of these things, studio performance play any of these things. And he's not unusual. Lots of people can play multiple instruments. And learning a new instrument does not automatically make them worse at all the other instruments. So this idea that somehow if you try to learn to do everything, you won't be good at anything, turns out to be a complete falsehood. Learning things is not a zero-sum game. And so learning all the things you need to do service design really well is something we should teach all designers, just like learning to do application level design, just like learning to do UI level design, and soon learning to do ecosystem level design. We need to be able to learn all the things. We need to have tools to do that. We need to understand what those tools are. And from that, we can then go off and create absolutely great experiences that work in the environments we need them to work in, whether we're staring at a screen or talking to a person.
Beautiful. One more question maybe before Jared goes. One more question. He's on fire right now. Let's take advantage of that.
There's a lot of chatter in the chat about, what do we do on LinkedIn essentially, but I wanted to get back to
maybe we need to talk to LinkedIn service designers.
Yeah.
I want to touch base on this one that Howard asked a bit ago, and Howard, you can elaborate. Jared, you said ecosystem designer, and your emphasis was on skills over titles, right? Which is a lot of what we're talking about right now. So
I said ecosystem design. I didn't say ecosystem designer.
Okay, you said ecosystem design. So his question was, what is the ideal skill set of an ecosystem designer, if such a thing is?
Well, it's going to be things of how do you actually implement research and implement systemic change across multiple organizations for which there is not one point of governance. That's sort of the core that I see ecosystem design. So this gets into things like standards and APIs, and how do organizations work together under what sets of rules, policies, right? You get into a variety of intermixed things, and you want to make sure that all the voices are heard, that you're not keeping power in one place, but in fact, you're disseminating power across, but you do it in a way that allows you to understand what's happening across those systems. So to give an example, we saw it with getting vaccines to everybody in the world at the same time, right? You have the World Health Organization, who has absolutely no authority over the individual or vaccine producers or the way those vaccines are distributed. You have the European Union, which was negotiating its own agreement for its member countries for vaccines, different from the way the United States was integrating them, in such a way that the European Union actually negotiated themselves to not be able to get early batches of vaccines because the United States had negotiated a position with the vaccine manufacturers to get them. And they're the only manufacturer that the European Union had a negotiation with, AstraZeneca, actually fell through. So we have all of these problems with how do we solve the problem for the next pandemic to make sure the vaccines are distributed across the world. An ecosystem designer is going to need to understand the organizational dynamics of how all those institutions and organizations work in order to coordinate the equal availability of vaccines across a large global economy. And that is as much of a design problem as service design, as app design, as UI design. It's just at a different level.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something that everybody kind of feels in their gut, but maybe they're afraid to say it out loud. But I mean, Mark Stickdorn, one of our very first guests on our post-pandemic meetups, everybody was like, he was describing service design, and somebody said, well, this sounds a lot like business design. And he was like, yeah, sure, because it is. I don't care what you call it, right? Just do the thing, right? And I'm just here to give you the tools that you need to solve problems. And I think that's, if I had to encapsulate today's session, that's what it is. We're here to solve problems, and there's nobody here, whether a UXD or an SD, that isn't equipped with the tool sets and the models and the things that we need to solve a problem.
Right. But one of the things is this, right? There are some patterns about the resolutions. One is, that's really important to acknowledge, is that when we were back in the 90s and the 80s, when we were focused on interface design, we couldn't understand the problems of user experience design, of app design, of website design. We couldn't understand that until we solved most of the problems of UI design. The problems that we were solving here occupied our complete attention. And until we had the skills and we had this under control, that's when we started to be able to work on this. And we didn't really start working on service design until we figured out how to just navigate around apps and how to connect screens and how to get flows to work, right? And it wasn't until we had multiple apps that we started to think about service design. We could start to see the problems of service design. So one of the phenomena is we cannot see the problems of the next layer until we have the current layer under control. So if we think that service design is our current layer, we don't really understand the problems of ecosystem design, because we're still dealing with trying to get service design to work in most places. So when Mark Stickdorn is saying service design and business design are the same thing, he's right. He's talking about the fact that business design is a bunch of discrete things that have to be connected and work together. But there's a big difference between business design and ecosystem design, in that in ecosystem design, there's not one single point of governance. In service design, the CEO can say, you know what, from now on, we are going to connect all of our electronic things in this way, and everyone will connect all. There's a single point of governance. There's a single person or entity that can say, this is how it will be done, and everybody will do it that way. And so the jump to ecosystem design is what happens when we no longer have that, when it all has to be negotiated and you have to treat everybody as equal partners. Marketing and sales and development and UX don't have to be treated as equal partners in a business. But in an ecosystem, if one group has all the power, the system fails. So you have to be able to distribute power equally. And so our design system has to understand how to distribute power. And we don't have tools and methods. We don't have the equivalent of a service blueprint to talk about that yet. And that's where the work has to get done. We're still sort of pioneering, to use colonialist language. We're still pioneering what that actually means.
Very good. I think that we're going to be able to wrap it up. Jared, thank you so much for having me over. We finally I don't know why it took 2 years to have you here, but it was wonderful to have you finally. Looking forward to have you again, maybe. I'm glad we're able to do something very inclusive and very amicable, and there's a lot of like Twitter stuff out there. So I'm glad we're actually able to come together and have this nice, aggregation of stuff. Thank you so much, Jared. We'll see you online as always, and then maybe we can do something else in the future.
That sounds fantastic.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks all.
Thank you all.